I want to start by slowing this story down because if you've been following the news, you probably think you already understand what happened. Canada rerouted aluminum exports. The United States ran into shortages. Prices surged. Politicians complained. End of story. But that summary skips the part that really matters, the part that explains why this didn't just happen by chance, but was almost certain once key decisions were made in Washington. I've spent decades studying the intersection of trade policy and real-world industrial systems, and I can say with confidence this was no accident, no surprise, and definitely not bad luck. It was the predictable outcome of treating economics like a slogan instead of a system. On the surface, the administration presented this as a story of toughness. Tariffs were meant to protect American workers, revive domestic smelters, and restore some imagined industrial independence. That sounds comforting, especially if you worry about deindustrialization or job loss. But comfort is not the same as reality. Look beyond the rhetoric. Examine how aluminum moves through the modern economy, and the logic falls apart. The United States does not make enough primary aluminum to meet its own needs. It hasn't for years. We rely almost entirely on imports, with Canada as the most dependable supplier, integrated into North American manufacturing as tightly as any supply chain anywhere. So when tariffs hit Canadian aluminum, this wasn't a move against a hostile rival. It was a shock delivered straight into our own industrial system. Policymakers assumed Canada would absorb the pain, accept lower margins, and keep shipping south because they had no choice. That assumption shows a deep misunderstanding of how global markets operate today. Capital moves, contracts shift, suppliers adapt. Canada did exactly what any rational economic actor would do when facing political uncertainty and added costs. They redirected exports to buyers willing to pay market prices without turning trade into a political gamble. Once that happened, the consequences spread quickly. American manufacturers that rely on aluminum, including everything from cars to airplanes, construction materials, and beverage cans, suddenly competed for a shrinking supply. Prices didn't just rise gradually, they spiked. Delivery schedules became unreliable, and just-in-time systems keeping modern factories running smoothly started to jam. This wasn't theoretical harm. This was real operational damage hitting companies with thin margins and tight deadlines. What makes this episode so revealing is it exposes a fantasy at the heart of modern tariff politics. The fantasy is that supply chains are static, allies have no alternatives, and political power can override economic structure without consequences. But supply chains are dynamic networks, not command hierarchies. Inject volatility, and you don't get obedience. You get reconfiguration. Canada didn't punish the United States out of spite. They simply reduced exposure to an unreliable partner and sought stability elsewhere. There's another layer rarely discussed. Even the aluminum that still reached the U.S. market saw prices rise beyond the tariff itself. Businesses price in risk. When governments show they can change rules abruptly, suppliers add an uncertainty premium. That premium doesn't appear in press briefings, but it appears on invoices. It isn't paid by politicians, it's paid by manufacturers and ultimately by consumers, quietly and relentlessly. This is where the story leaves abstract theory and touches everyday life. When aluminum prices jump, companies face three choices: cut labor, cut investment, or raise prices. Most do all three. That leads to delayed expansions, canceled hiring, higher prices on cars, appliances, building materials, and food packaging. This is how a policy sold as protecting workers becomes a machine spreading economic insecurity. And all of it was predictable. No hindsight needed, just a basic understanding of interdependence and incentives, something economists have warned about for decades. This moment didn't reveal Canadian strength, it revealed American vulnerability. Not because the country is weak, but because policy relied on denial rather than arithmetic. That's the deeper story behind the aluminum headlines. And if we don't face it honestly, we'll keep repeating the same mistakes under different slogans. What worries me even more is what happened after the price shock settled and the political noise moved on. The phase rarely discussed where the real transfer of wealth occurs. When tariffs raise imported aluminum prices, domestic producers don't heroically hold the line out of patriotism. They follow market signals. They raise prices to just below the new tariff-inflated ceiling. Even firms buying entirely American aluminum end up paying more, not for government revenue, but because the market has been artificially reset upward. That difference matters. Tariffs are often sold as a way to raise public revenue while encouraging domestic production. In practice, much of the extra money never reaches the Treasury. It becomes a windfall for a small number of upstream producers. This is income generated not by better technology, productivity, or innovation, but by political intervention. And it's crucial to see how small this group really is. A handful of smelters benefiting from price protection, while tens of thousands of downstream firms shoulder higher costs. The imbalance is staggering. Downstream firms employ most industrial workers, stamping parts, assembling vehicles, fabricating structures, packaging food. Millions of people depend on them. When input costs soar, the pressure doesn't vanish, it flows downhill. Wages stall, overtime is cut, investment is delayed, prices rise. Communities feel it slowly, then suddenly. Yet the policy discussion remains fixated on whether a few upstream facilities stay profitable behind a tariff wall. This is classic concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. The winners are few, organized, well-funded, and motivated. The losers are many, scattered, rarely heard as one voice. A soda can costing a few cents more doesn't trigger outrage. A car costing hundreds more often isn't traced back to trade policy. Politics responds to intensity, not scale. That's how policies quietly draining the broader economy survive long after their damage is obvious. National security was the justification, and that matters. Invoking security allows executives to bypass normal trade rules and democratic scrutiny. But claiming Canadian aluminum is a security threat falls apart under examination. Canada isn't an adversary, it's a deeply integrated ally. We share defense production, military coordination, and strategic planning. Treating that partnership as a vulnerability makes us more isolated and brittle. While U.S. manufacturers struggled with higher costs and supply uncertainty, competitors abroad bought aluminum at stable global prices, often the very same Canadian aluminum redirected away from the U.S. That gave them a built-in cost advantage. When German or Asian firms can source materials cheaper and more reliably than American ones, the result is predictable. Contracts shift, market share erodes, investment follows stability. This isn't ideology, it's arithmetic. Over time, the outcome isn't dramatic collapse, but slow hollowing out. Companies expand elsewhere. New plants are built outside the U.S. supply chains quietly reorient. By the time closures make headlines, the damage is done. The cruel irony, this erosion hits the manufacturing jobs politicians claim to defend. There's also a trust issue. Businesses depend on predictability. When governments overturn long-standing agreements abruptly, firms shorten planning horizons, hold more inventory, diversify markets, and treat political risk as a permanent cost. Even if tariffs lift tomorrow, the memory of the shock stays in corporate strategy. Volatility lingers long after the policy that caused it ends. That's why this wasn't strength. It was fragility exposed. True resilience comes from reliable partnerships and diversified supply networks, being the partner others want to work with. Replacing cooperation with coercion didn't make us independent. It made us vulnerable to the very disruptions we claim to fear. And that isn't random. It's the predictable outcome of mixing political theater with economic reality. At this point, notice how the media framed this story, because the framing itself reveals a lot about how economic power works. Most coverage focused on personalities, on who said what, who looked angry or defiant. Panels gushed over trade wars and national pride, winners and losers in a geopolitical chess game. What was mostly missing was a serious look at structure. Almost no one asked the simplest question: who actually pays when input costs rise across an integrated economy? When prices increase quietly and gradually, responsibility vanishes. There's no single villain to blame when a refrigerator costs more or a construction project exceeds budget. The link between trade policy and everyday costs is intentionally obscured, not always out of conspiracy, but for convenience. Structural explanations don't fit neatly into sound bites. They don't drive clicks. So instead of asking why costs rise systemically, we debate tone, patriotism, and blame. That distraction benefits the same groups financially profiting. While downstream manufacturers struggled, upstream producers enjoyed protected margins. They didn't suddenly become more efficient. They didn't revolutionize technology. They simply operated under a politically imposed price floor. And when protection like that exists, companies act rationally. They don't risk billions on long-term upgrades if the policy could vanish after the next election. They extract value while it's available. That's why the promised manufacturing revival never arrives. Tariffs are a poor substitute for real industrial strategy. If the goal were self-sufficiency, the policy would look completely different. It would involve long-term investment, coordination, and modernization. Instead, we got a short-term price shock that shifted wealth upward while weakening the base of the industrial pyramid. The policy rewarded owners, not production. It protected balance sheets, not workers. Now consider how this plays out in a typical factory. Picture a mid-sized manufacturer using aluminum parts. The company is already pressured by global competition. Margins are tight. They're trying to invest in equipment, keep wages competitive, and retain skilled staff. Then input costs spike and supply becomes uncertain. Suddenly, every plan is risky. Do you expand when materials aren't guaranteed? Do you hire when costs are unpredictable? 6 months in, caution takes over. Investment freezes. Growth stalls. Over time, that caution becomes permanent. Companies adapt not by boosting domestic productivity, but by reducing exposure. They source abroad, they relocate processes, they restructure supply chains to lessen reliance on U.S. production. These moves aren't ideological, they're defensive, and once made, they're hard to undo. A factory built elsewhere doesn't magically return because a tariff is lifted. What we're seeing is a lesson about power and incentives. Markets respond to risk, not speeches. When the US government showed trade rules could be weaponized unpredictably, it sent a message. Access to the American market now comes with political volatility. Volatility is costly. Firms pay to avoid it if alternatives exist. This part of the story should concern us most, not Canada's decision, which was entirely rational, but our own response. We treated interdependence as weakness, not strength. We mistook leverage for control. In doing so, we undermined the industrial base we claim to protect. That's not a messaging problem, it's a structural failure. Until we confront it honestly, this cycle will repeat under new slogans. Let's dig deeper. The aluminum episode isn't really about aluminum, it's about how power works in an economy where ownership and lobbying outweigh productive capacity. Following money through the system reveals a clear pattern. Policies appear national on the surface, but really shield narrow private interests underneath. Public language is about workers and security. Private results are about margins and market power. This is where we must speak openly about lobbying and access. Upstream industries like primary aluminum are concentrated. Few firms, clear incentives, resources to shape policy. Downstream industries are fragmented. Thousands of firms, millions of workers, no unified voice. That imbalance matters. In Washington, the loudest organized interests dominate decisions. The outcome? Policy that looks strong but is structurally regressive. Then there's the national security argument, constantly recycled. The logic, if we don't produce something domestically, we're vulnerable. But vulnerability depends on context. Depending on a hostile power is risky. Depending on a trusted integrated ally is not the same and is often safer. Incentives align, stability grows, redundancy improves. We had that system. We dismantled it in the name of toughness. What's especially damaging is the loss of institutional trust. Once lost, trust is costly to regain. Canadian producers learned contracts with U.S. buyers could suddenly become political liabilities. European and Asian buyers saw Canada as a more predictable partner. Over time, that reputation shift hardens. Markets remember and behavior adjusts permanently, not temporarily. Meanwhile, American workers face a more volatile environment, not due to skill or productivity, but because the ground keeps shifting. When supply chains destabilize, workers bear the cost. Layoffs happen faster than expansions. Wage pressure flows downward. Communities absorb shocks long before balance sheets do. This is how abstract policy decisions translate into real anxiety at the kitchen table. There's a subtle but important point here. By raising domestic prices, tariffs act like a hidden tax. It doesn't appear on a paycheck, it shows up at the checkout. And because everyone relies on goods made with aluminum, the burden is widely shared while the benefits are narrowly captured. This is why inequality grows, even when policies are presented as populist. The structure of the transfer matters far more than the slogan attached to it. Meanwhile, competitors abroad quietly gain. Lower input costs overseas improve pricing power in global markets. That advantage compounds. A company that wins contracts today gains capacity, experience, and scale for tomorrow. American firms, on the other hand, face higher costs and greater uncertainty. That gap doesn't shrink naturally, it widens. That's why I keep emphasizing this wasn't an error in execution, it was a mistake in thinking. A worldview seeing trade as domination rather than cooperation will keep producing these results. You can swap target countries, change the rhetoric, but if the underlying logic is the same, the outcome will be too. Unless we rethink that logic, we'll keep mistaking economic self-harm for strength, paying for it in ways that rarely hit the evening news. By now, the larger pattern is clear, and it's not just about aluminum or trade policy. This is how modern capitalism resolves conflicts between concentrated power and dispersed public interest. When the two clash, power almost always wins quietly, not by conspiracy, but through structure. The system favors those who can organize, lobby, and present private gains as public necessity. Everyone else absorbs costs incrementally, too small to provoke collective action. What makes this corrosive is how it reshapes expectations. Workers are told instability is normal, volatility inevitable, uncertainty part of living in a competitive world. But notice who is shielded from uncertainty and who bears it. Owners and executives gain from price protection and policy shields. Workers and small businesses are asked to be flexible, resilient, and patient. Risk flows downward, reward flows upward. Over time, this erodes not only incomes, but confidence. People stop believing policy serves them. They see it as distant, erratic, and unresponsive. That perception isn't irrational. When economic decisions ignore how real systems function, trust collapses. People feel the economy happens to them, not for them. That sense of powerlessness fosters anger, misinformation, and division. There's also a generational aspect rarely discussed. Young workers entering manufacturing or skilled trades face an unpredictable environment. Instead of steady investment and long-term planning, they see stop-start cycles driven by politics. That makes committing to careers, building communities, and imagining stability much harder. An economy that can't provide predictability struggles to maintain loyalty, which once anchored industrial regions. Here's the bitter irony. Policies sold as restoring sovereignty often reduce it. When domestic industries depend on protection instead of competitiveness, they lose leverage. They stop pushing modernization. They stop innovating aggressively. They rely on political favor instead of technical excellence. Meanwhile, firms in stable environments build real strength. They compete on cost, quality, and reliability. That's what true sovereignty looks like in an interconnected world. We also need to notice how quickly emergency logic becomes routine. Once national security is used to justify intervention, it becomes a shortcut. Debate shrinks, oversight weakens. Decisions concentrate in fewer hands. That's dangerous, not just for trade policy, but for democracy. Economic decisions affecting millions shouldn't be made habitually through exceptional powers. None of this suggests markets should be unregulated or governments absent. It means their role must be grounded in reality, not nostalgia. Industrial policy works when strategic, transparent, and long-term. It fails when reactive, symbolic, or captured by narrow interests. The aluminum episode shows what failure looks like in practice. If we don't learn, we'll see the same script repeat. Different sector, different country, same logic, same result, higher prices, weaker industry, more insecurity, and the same puzzled question. Why does it feel like we keep losing even when we're told we're winning?